Hello, chaps. I'm seeing these headlines about how the Westerners are saying that Putin is going to cut off the supply of gas to them, and they're worried about this. And it's really bizarre. So in one way, it makes sense, right? The West is being hostile to Russia in the sense that it's supplying the country that Russia is invading with weapons. So it would kind of make sense for Russia to cut off their gas supply as a retaliatory measure, especially since the West has been pissing off Russia in various other ways. I don't want to go into all of them. So it makes sense, but at the same time, it's really bizarre because Europe and the West have been trying to sanction Russia. They've been trying to move away from Russian gas. So isn't this kind of what you wanted? And you could say, well, yes, it's what we want, but we don't want to do it immediately. We have to set up alternative supply routes. And okay, so that makes sense. You're worried that the Russians will sanction you before you're ready to sanction them. But it gets even weirder, because the thing that appears to have triggered this round of, we're really worried that the Russians will cut off the supply, is the Nord Stream 1 shutdown. But that shutdown appears to have been triggered by the fact that it needs maintenance, and there's this turbine that was sent over to Canada to be repaired in some specialist thing. The Canadians seized the turbine under the sanctions, and then eventually the US and Germany said, no, please give us the turbine back. So they finally got the turbine back to be used in the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. So that is a case where you're worried that Putin will permanently cut off gas because look what he's already doing in Nord Stream 1. But actually it was the Western sanctions that interfered with that pipeline, supposedly. And you could say, well, the Russians are lying. They didn't really need to repair it. Well, you really want to take that risk with a huge infrastructure project like that? I mean, and even if it's true and they didn't really need the turbine from Canada and they were just faking, well, just give it to them anyway. Call their bluff. If you want it to be running, why don't you just give them the turbine? And it's a bit like that earlier thing where countries are refusing to pay in rubles for gas from Russia, so Russia cut some of them off, and then they just end up buying it indirectly via Germany instead. A typical absurdity of these sanctions where they sanction Russian fuel supplies, sort of, but it just ends up being supplied to them indirectly. Like Ukraine isn't buying fuel from Russia, so it buys fuel from Europe, but Europe has to buy it from Russia. It's just really just constant weirdnesses like that, and probably Russian oil, if it gets sanctioned, well, love finds a way. So they'll just blend the Russian fuel over in Asia or something with someone else's fuel, and then it won't count as Russian if it's only 40% Russian. There's so many loopholes. But you see this absurdity of this paranoia, Putin, and by the way, it's so unprofessional and stupid to say Putin this, Putin that. I even saw a headline saying Europe is dependent on Putin for gas supplies. No, it's dependent on Russia. The gas supply is coming from a country called Russia, and it's not a man called Putin. It's Vladimir Putin. His full title is President Putin of Russia. This is so casual and informal. I really hate it. And you've been sanctioning him. You wanted to sanction him, and the sanctions are driven by the US. Now, I actually still think that it's possible that Putin could cut off the gas supply, so maybe these fears aren't entirely groundless, but so far it is the West that has been sanctioning Russia, like with the ruble payments thing, where Russia cut off fuel supplies because people wouldn't pay in rubles. I'm no expert, but I'm pretty sure they wanted the payment in rubles because if you pay in dollars, I'm really not an expert, but if you pay in dollars, then that means it could just get confiscated, because if it's dollars, it's held in some sort of Western piece of financial infrastructure, and they can confiscate it like how they confiscated much of Russia's foreign reserves, so the famed 300 billion, not all of which has necessarily been confiscated. But anyway, the conclusion of this video, I had to do a whole load of ranting just to set the scene there, but the conclusion of this video is I'm asking, why are we worried that Russia will cut off the gas to Europe when it's so far being us throwing tantrums against Russia on trade? And I think it's possible that all these headlines are not actually worried about Russia cutting off the fuel. They're actually worried about the authorities in the West, especially the US, enforcing sanctions to cut off the supply. Because the US does exert a substantial amount of control over the governments of Europe, so it can, to some extent, force them into that. And so when you say Russia is going to could cause a catastrophe by shutting down the supply of gas to us. Now, if you were actually worried that Russia would do that, I don't think you would say, oh, you'll totally destroy our economy if you do that, and then we will have an even harder time supplying Ukraine with weapons and paying Ukraine this and manufacturing more Javelin missiles or HIMARS or whatever. You wouldn't say that if you were worried that Russia would do it. You'd say, it won't hurt our economy at all. We'll be fine. You'll just be losing the money that we pay you for the gas. That's what you'd say if you're worried that Russia would do it. They might actually be saying this because they don't want the US to enforce the sanctions. But they don't want to sound as if they're criticizing the US. They don't want to sound as if they want to stay on just barely decent working terms with Russia, because everyone has to be anti-Putin. Putin, Putin, Putin. Not Russia. Putin. And not President Putin. Putin, the monster. You have to be negative about him. So instead of saying something critical about the US, which is these sanction policies that we came up with are a terrible idea because they're ruining our economy and they could ruin it more if we enforce them more, instead of saying that, you say Putin is going to do it. Because I think that might make more sense, and this might be sort of a projection, sort of a very slavish, indirect way of speaking, where you're worried that person A will do something. You don't want them to do it, but you're too much of a pathetic slave to actually say, don't do that, it's a bad idea. So you say, oh, if person B did that thing that they are planning to do, well, actually it's person A planning to do it. Oh, if person B did that, it would be so awful. I think that's what's going on. I think that might be what's going on. At the same time, it is also possible that President Vladimir Putin, or Tsar Vladimir, as I like to call him, Peter the Great the Second, as I like to call him, he might actually be planning on a shutdown, just because the West is so hostile and supporting the Ukraine. But I honestly think it could be that. I think it could be warning against a US, an American foreign policy decision, but framing it as something the Russians might do. Because these people at Insider and whatever this ABC News or something, whatever these shithole Western media, they're all the same. It's the Western media which is totally servile and slavish towards the America, and they don't want to criticize anything about America. Well, its current rulers anyway. So they just phrase it as Russia. That's what I think is going on here. Another thing is the sort of projection, psychological projection. You accuse someone of negative feelings, negative intentions, which you yourself hold. And I've seen all this stuff about how Russia uses fuel as blackmail over Europe. But that doesn't really make any sense, because we're the ones that have been disrupting the fuel trade, and we did that with the deliberate intention of causing a recession in Russia, like it says in one of these articles. We did it, even, according to some people, to overthrow Putin, which was obviously never going to happen, but they believed they could do that, just like they thought bombing Libya would turn it into a democracy, which it technically is now, but it's not a very good one, and it wasn't worth the 10 years of devastation. Yeah, it's projection. We're the ones that have a hostile intention towards Russia. We're the ones that have disrupted the trade. We're the ones that have blockaded Svalbard and Kaliningrad. We're the ones that confiscated some of its foreign reserves. We're the ones that kicked it off SWIFT. But we're saying that Putin... and it's still annoying me that they call it Putin. It's President Putin to you, thanks, you fucking peasant. Oh, I shouldn't swear. Does YouTube let you swear? I honestly don't know. Hey, I may swear, but I love transgenders. I just want to say that. Especially black transgenders who commit crimes. They're amazing. And the police have no right to arrest them. And if the black transgender resists arrest, then the police are just evil murderers if they pull out their guns and use them. I just want to say that. George Floyd died of being asphyxiated with a knee to the back of his neck because his windpipe, George Floyd's windpipe was actually... It wasn't located on the front of your neck like a normal human being. It was actually located on the back of his neck. So if you're wondering how do you strangle someone by putting your knee on the back of their neck, now you understand how that happened. Anyway, I'm just rambling now. I love George Floyd. Please don't put a strike on this video.